Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It's 7:05, so we'll get started and continue to allow people to enter as we roll. We are recording this evening, so you will get a link to that recording, and we'll say that a few more times tonight as people come in late and ask that question. Um, I'm Susie Creamer, Center Director at Patterson Park Audubon Center in beautiful Baltimore, Maryland, USA. Thank you for those of you who are also here from the Mid-Atlantic this evening, but from several other states around the US. And so far we've got Canada and Hungary among our international participants. So welcome. I want to give an overview of a couple things here, what to expect this evening. First of all, Erin is having a little glitch on her computer with this little copy shared link. You see this little thing that's going to be in the middle of the screen all night long. Can't get it to go away right now. So I'm sure you can bear with us on that and you'll be able to see most of what you need to see. So thank you in advance for your patience. As you know, this is a 90-minute webinar, but there is also an optional Q&A that will follow those 90 minutes. So you're welcome to stay for that as well. Throughout the webinar, we do ask that you keep yourselves on mute, and there should be a little place at the bottom left part of your screen to click on the microphone. There should be a red line through it. Usually we can mute everyone, but sometimes iPads and things somehow escape that mute all feature. So thank you for helping with that. We also ask that you, throughout the presentation, Erin will be talking. She will not be looking at her chat. So do not message Erin, but you can message me privately or chat to everyone. If it's a question you have that is helpful to all that you might think it might be, please don't be afraid to ask that in the public setting. So as you are watching, other people will be asking questions. And so I will answer those as concisely as I can in the chat. I'll save some. I sort of pick and choose a few to save for Erin when she stops throughout to ask for questions. And then there's much more time for a Q&A at the end, as I said. I do ask that when you're asking questions that they stay on topic and not telling a long story about the bluebird nest in the bluebird box, or why aren't the bats coming to my bat box, or these kinds of things. But let's focus on plants for birds. And tonight, as you know, is kind of our next level 2 wildlife gardening workshop focused more on design considerations. So many of you, I'm sure, attended the first introductory workshop to wildlife gardening. And as Erin will say shortly, we're assuming you have all that knowledge and you're ready to go to the next level. So we will not take a break, so do take one if you need. As I said a moment ago, you will receive the link to the recording of the presentation, and that will come out tomorrow with a number of helpful links in a follow-up email, and some of those are links to our survey. We do ask that input is really important to get your feedback as we continue to develop and evolve with our virtual programming. And also there'll be links to some key information on our website, such as our favorite plants list for birds for this region of the world. Many of the things we'll talk about will be universal, right, as many of you are from different places. But when we get to talking about specific plants, we're talking about native plants to this region. So you may have additional homework to do if you're not familiar with those in your own region, but that's okay. It's all good stuff. I will make sure you see that link in the chat, as well as in that follow-up email about how to apply for your Audubon bird-friendly sign. I can share those links directly for Pennsylvania has a program, and so does Maryland and DC for Audubon. That's the one that we run here, the Patterson Park Audubon Center in Baltimore. We do encourage you and invite you to donate to support Patterson Park Audubon Center. It's really awesome that we're part of this big thing called National Audubon Society, but we do have to raise all of our funds locally. So we love offering programs free and open to the public, just like this one. So if you are able, and we know COVID has been hard on folks, but if you're able to support us, we'd love for you to make a gift tonight. I can share that link as well in the chat. Do join us for other webinars and other fun things coming up. Since we have your email, we'll send you occasional updates on cool stuff happening and invite you to participate in that. And we do hope to hear how your gardens are coming along. And remember, you are an ambassador of sorts, that you are sharing this message with your neighbors and hopefully getting your Audubon sign to brag, but also invite conversation and encourage others to garden in ways that are beneficial to local birds and insects. And the last thing I want to tell you is super exciting. We are celebrating this week and going forward. Just last week, we got a proclamation from the mayor of Baltimore City, Mayor Scott, as well as a ceremonial resolution from City Council, both of these recognizing our work at the center. And specifically, the proclamation is about native plants for birds in Baltimore. And so having the mayor's excitement and I don't want to say consent, but his enthusiasm to sign off and say this is important stuff to our city, both to wildlife, but also to communities, human communities, is really exciting. So all week long, we are sharing the celebration virtually via Facebook and Instagram pages. Erin, do you mind chatting what they should look for the handle on Instagram and Facebook to remind folks? But you can see each day we have a video posting. Tomorrow we have 3 quick little videos from our green leaders. Those are our middle school leaders saying their important messages and why they love native plants. So we've got one from the mayor, among other elected officials and stuff. Anyway, it's all very exciting, but it's important, right? To get this happening in more places is to have that municipal support for getting the right kinds of plants in our cities and communities. So thank you, Erin, for sharing those things. I'll share those links I just mentioned. And with that, I will introduce Erin Reed Miller, our education manager at Patterson Park Audubon Center. She is a Baltimore City Master Gardener and the person who developed the Audubon Recognition Program, meaning the yard sign program that we now run for Maryland and DC. And she is well equipped. For those of you who know Dr. Doug Tallamy, she studied with him in her master's program. And so she's your girl tonight. She's got all the info. And please do, as I say, ask questions in the chat. If you missed it before, ask me questions or ask everyone questions, but don't message Erin. She won't be looking at that. And yes, this will be recorded and you'll get a link to that. Get away, Erin.
Okay, thanks. Just gonna switch our spotlight here. Thanks, Susie, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight, at least here in Baltimore. It is an absolutely gorgeous day outside, and the fact that we're on a Zoom feels a little bit like, we all want to be out in our gardens, but just thank you so much for welcoming us into your homes tonight. So as Susie mentioned, this workshop is designed to be a more advanced step forward from the more introductory wildlife gardening workshop that we've been conducting for several years. So we are going to review some of the basics just in case some of you haven't joined us for that. So if you have just recently taken the introductory workshop, you might recognize a few of the slides at the beginning. So be patient, but otherwise we will operate under the assumption that we all know and understand the importance of native plants and local food webs. So before we get to any of that, I wanted to offer, especially for those of you who are joining us from outside Baltimore City, just a glimpse into Patterson Park Audubon Center, the importance of the urban oasis that is Patterson Park. If you have never been there, it's such an iconic and amazing place. I hope you get to visit. And then what you all can do to help share our city with wildlife. So take a look and a listen. All right, so as Susie mentioned, we are part of National Audubon Society. So this international nonprofit organization focused on protecting birds in particular and bird habitats where birds live in general. But of course, we know that we all share the same spaces. We all rely on the same support systems. So creating greener, cleaner cities benefits all of us. And so the work that we do at Patterson Park Audubon Center is for the birds, but it's also for the benefit of the people who live here in Baltimore. And so we do that in lots of different ways, engaging neighbors of all ages in the creation and enjoyment of bird-friendly habitat. Some of that is through our school programs. Of course, I haven't seen these kiddos in over a year, but some of our youngest nature lovers are already doing community science and planting native plants. We also have public programs, volunteer programs, and those cover, the gamut from our 2-year-old tiny tots through all ages. And then we also do as many of our programs as possible in English and in Spanish. Patterson Park is surrounded by this amazing multicultural neighborhoods. And so we love to celebrate that diversity surrounding Patterson Park, which of course reflects the wonderful biodiversity to be found in the park. But, of course, this habitat isn't just beautiful for people. It is critical for billions of birds that pass through our flyway twice each year. So if you haven't heard of this term called a flyway, it's essentially birds' migratory highways in the sky. And of course, birds aren't just taking off one day and then flying hundreds or thousands of miles and landing in their destinations. They require the habitat beneath those flyways for them to rest and refuel. And spoiler alert, I'm sure this is why you're all here. That habitat beneath the flyways is what's right outside your window. So take a look out there. That's the habitat where these billions of birds could be landing as they're migrating. Maybe not billions of birds, maybe just a few. So we here in Baltimore belong to this great network of Audubon centers. This is why we love hearing where you're from, because all of us at centers and Audubon chapters, and then all of you bird-friendly gardeners across the entire hemisphere are making up this amazing network. And here in the Atlantic Flyway, I'll brag a little bit. I happen to think, in my unbiased opinion, that it is the best flyway. It's home to some of the most productive ecosystems in the world, but also home to about 1/3 of the US population. So all of us here tonight, we're all focused on combating an issue with which you're probably well aware. I don't like to spend too much time on doom and gloom. I know that you're all here because you're doers, but just to illustrate the issue a little bit, these maps in the following few slides represent the density of housing in the United States. So how close our kind of human-dominated spaces are together. So, back in the 1940s, our country looked like this. Those red areas are the most densely populated areas. And so if you look for those red areas, we see these urban centers, especially along the eastern United States, that were pretty much these isolated cores surrounded by farms and open land. This is 1940. But just within the span of one lifetime, within the last 75 years, those housing densities have exploded. And over time, those relatively consolidated urban areas have spilled out into the surrounding landscape. So this is 1980. And by this year, we had already converted millions of acres into housing developments and urban and suburban sprawl. This was only 10 years ago, and we can see that the eastern half of our country has seen such a tremendous increase in housing densities, and it's only projected to get worse. So this is less than 10 years from now. The projected density of housing by the year 2030, we've already lost about 150 million acres of ecologically productive land. But the thing that I want to point out with this is all of that housing density, that represents human-dominated spaces. These are spaces that we actually have control over. They're the space that I just told you to look at outside your window. And so the solution seems pretty simple. As long as all of us can get all of our neighbors on board, all of that red space is where we live. It's our neighborhoods. And so a bird-friendly habitat in those spaces allows us to share our homes, our schools, our community spaces, our businesses, those places in our neighborhoods with birds and other kinds of biodiversity. So no matter where you live, no matter what size of a space you have for a garden, each of our efforts has this incredible collective impact in sustaining bird populations, because honestly, you just never know where that exhausted Baltimore Oriole is going to land. Each of our patches make up this patchwork quilt. When a bird looks down on the landscape as it's migrating, it's seeing all of these corridors and connections that we're creating. So we hopefully remember from kindergarten is when I start teaching the basic requirements of a habitat. Hopefully we remember this from kindergarten, that all living things need food, water, shelter, space, and nesting sites. We get a lot of questions during these workshops about bird feeders. And yes, bird feeders and nest boxes can supplement your habitat, but our real goal here is for our gardens to be our bird feeders and for our gardens to be our nest boxes. So if you have questions about bird feeders and nest boxes, there are so many online resources where you can find those, but we're going to talk about how to design our gardens in a way that can be our own bird feeders. I mentioned during our introductory workshop, so I know that this is a review, but it's worth mentioning again that birds feed on a really wide variety of foods throughout their life cycle and throughout the seasons. And so we'll just go through our bird food groups really quickly. So we know that we need our nectar food group. It's what's attracting all of our insect pollinators, which of course are food for birds. We'll get to that in a second. But this nectar food group is also a really important component of your landscape design. Just think, where we're getting all of our color and our fragrance from all of those nectar producing flowers. We also want to make sure to incorporate seed producing plants. These seeds are full of nutrients and minerals and healthy fats. Just think of the same reasons why nuts are superfoods for humans. And so it's really important in our bird-friendly landscapes that we maintain those seed heads through the winter. And then those dried stems of those herbaceous plants are also harboring overwintering insects. So we want to make sure that our gardens stay nice and messy in the winter, and then we can tidy them up after it gets warm in the spring and those insects have emerged and all of those seeds have, built up the bodies of our birds. Berries, really critically important, especially during birds' fall migration. The fat is what birds are looking for in those berries, and our native shrubs berries are timed in their ripening to perfectly coincide with birds' migration in the fall. And so they pack their seeds with inside these fatty sweet treats. But of course, not all berries are created equal. And so, it's an important thing to think about when we're choosing the types of species, the berry producing shrubs and other woody plants that we might want to plant in our bird-friendly landscape. We might think of species like dogwoods or spice bushes, but we have to remember our little bitty birds as well. So a black-throated blue warbler like this one might not tackle a big spice bush berry. But a species like American beautyberry, which is native to the Southeast US, will attract some of our smaller birds who need that fat to fuel their migration as well. I made a note for myself to remind all of you that if you're ever wondering where a plant exists, in the US at least, you can go to the USDA plants database. If you Google USDA plants, you'll find it. In the top left of that website, you can type in the scientific or the common name of a plant species or even a genus. And then when you click on that plant species, you'll see a map of where that plant exists, where it's native to, and where it's introduced. So I just made myself a note to mention that. I mentioned that, native plants have this amazing timing of the fat production in their berries. And I realize that this is kind of a sciencey, nerdy slide, but I consider myself a sciencey nerd. So what can I say? So the species on the top in red are non-native species. And if you look at those % fat content numbers in the red box, You can see that species like Japanese honeysuckle and multiflora rose have less than 1% fat in their berries, which is why you may have noticed that if you have species like that, or like I used to have a Bradford pear right in front of my house, your car, your sidewalk, your front steps will ultimately be littered with these sticky excrement of these berries going straight through birds because they have no real nutritional content. As compared with the species on the bottom in the green, our dogwoods, our viburnums, our spice bushes, between 30 and 40% fat in their berries. So, a bird eating these native species berries is going to be able to fuel, their energy for a lot longer than non-native species. And just interestingly, in case this ever comes up in a trivia night, the northern bayberry is a species that has been called, well, by this publication, it's called the Big Mac of plants, but that's not really very healthy. So I'd like to call it maybe like the avocado of plants. Just a lot of fat, over 50% fat in a bayberry compared to other species. So berries are important. And then I saved the best for last. Always, we need insects. We need insects to feed baby birds, and we know that insects need native plants. So a world without native plants is a world without insects, and a world without insects is a world without birds. So these are our building blocks of bird-friendly habitat. And our real task tonight is to put these into layers. And the reason that we need to put them into layers is because each layer of vegetation in our garden supports different species of birds and other wildlife. You can think of each of these layers as providing more niches for different species. So we can see in this diagram that the ground cover vegetation layer is where our thrushes and our sparrows are going to reside, while up in the canopy, we have our flycatchers and our raptors, things that need to perch and look down upon their prey. So as many of these different layers as you're able to incorporate into your garden is what's going to allow you to attract the most biodiversity. It's also going to make for a really beautiful space. So I wanted to mention two kind of Bibles of this work tonight. The book Planting in a Post-Wild World by Thomas Rainer and Claudia West talks all about these layers of a designed plant community and how each layer represents an ecological function as well as a design function. So, a way to make our gardens look beautiful. The Living Landscape by Rick Dark and Doug Tallamy has amazing photos that just kind of bring that concept to life. And the other amazing thing about the Living Landscape, I promise I'm not making a commission on this, I wish I was, about 25% of this book is an appendix at the back, which lists species by region and gives their landscape and ecological function of each species. So I have the book right next to me so I can refer to it, but there are all these little icons for whether it's a pollen producing plant or good for wintering birds or food for mammals. And then also if there are fall flowers or fall foliage color. So all of these different landscape functions, these design functions, as well as ecological functions. So it's a great resource. I will also mention here that, the idea behind these designed plant communities is not to really try to alter our landscape in any way. It's to try to work as much and as closely as we can to what we have. So that might start with trying to better understand what kind of soils you have. And there are, various ways that you can do that. But the idea is to kind of restore the species that should already thrive in what you have. You should not need to amend the soil in any way. You should try to plant for what you have. And, if you have gone anywhere in the world, I'm sure you've seen that there are very few places that support no plant species at all, right? So if you have rocky and dry soil, there are native plants for that. If you have a clay-filled and slow-draining soil, there are plants that thrive there as well. The exception would be if you are trying to plant food for your own, human consumption. That's not really what we're talking about tonight, but of course we know that soils can contain toxins and heavy metals. And so in those cases, you would want to build raised beds. But for the most part, we're trying to find plant species that fit the space that we have. There are 125 of us here right now tonight. So unfortunately, I'm probably not going to be able to go, one by one and come up with a design for the space that you have. But that's kind of like the homework that we'll take with us after the tips that we get tonight. But of course, feel free to ask. The chat, I will stop and ask, for questions in the chat, but you are also, resources to each other. Don't get too carried away so that you can't hear anything that I'm saying, but it's a good place that you could sort of seek advice from each other as well. So this is our goal. We are trying to find that fine line between design and nature, between form and function, as Claudia and Thomas put it, between horticulture and ecology. This is not our goal. And I hate to kind of hate on this person, whoever's garden this is, but this is an extremely traditional planting, albeit sort of a sad representation of a traditional planting. I may have done that on purpose, but this is sort of our traditional American aesthetic, right? We have plants surrounded by 12 to 18 inches of black mulch, and we wonder why things kind of shrivel up and die. So essentially what we're doing with a traditional planting like this is we are allowing sunlight to directly reach the ground in between our plants. And especially when we have this black mulch, it is such a heat sink. And as you can imagine, that dramatically raises the temperature of the soil. And of course, evaporates all of that plant essential soil moisture. We can think of it very similarly to a green roof planting and the extreme conditions that plants are exposed to on a green roof. If any of that roof media, that little rocky substance that you see there, if any of that is exposed, it dries out super quickly, and the temperatures there can reach 160 degrees Fahrenheit. So of course, even the hardiest species cannot survive such extreme conditions if they are planted in kind of our traditional masses or spaced too far apart. So that's essentially what we are subjecting our plants to when we surround them by 12 to 18 inches of mulch. So that's not our goal. This is our goal. We can significantly improve the microclimate and the growing conditions of the overall planting if we fill in those gaps between taller species with some tough ground covering plants such as let me get my little laser pointer, the Pennsylvania sedge. This is Carex pennsylvanica. Imagine in a more traditional planting, there might be like a swath, is that a word? A swath of mulch here, but instead we filled it in with this ground cover. And by filling in this niche, we have created a better growing condition for the more demanding species because it holds moisture. That Carex pennsylvanica holds moisture in the soil and keeps it available for the other plant roots. It also fills in holes that would otherwise be filled by nature. Okay, nature abhors a vacuum. If you leave an empty niche, nature will fill it, meaning with a weed. And so we want to fill that ground niche that will benefit the entire planting. This is essentially all the theory behind the Planting in a Post-Wild World book. It makes a whole lot of sense when you look at the roots of your plants in kind of a cross section like this. So when you buy Liatris, Blazing Star, it says to plant that plant 12 to 15 inches apart. And that makes sense when you look how deep and how wide that plant's roots go into the ground. Look, they're like 10 feet into the ground and probably a foot or two out to each side. So of course, if you plant that same species right up next to each other, their roots are going to compete and they will not be able to thrive. But if you space them 12 to 15 inches apart and don't put anything in between them, you are essentially leaving this void. And so that is where we want to put shallow rooted ground covers balanced in between these deep tap rooted tall grasses and perennials, so that they are not actually competing for the same water and nutrients. You know, think of a meadow or a woodland. The species are packed right up against each other, and somehow yet their roots are not competing with each other because you have taller species interspersed with ground cover, shallow rooted ground cover species. So that's kind of the theory behind where we're going tonight. Now, where do we start? So budget. Of course, that's the answer. Where to start with your budget. So I'm sure all of us have these dreams of turning our entire properties into these vast forests and meadows. But of course, depending on our budget, this change might have to be incremental, and that's okay. The worst thing that we could do is try to spread our budget over too large of an area and have plants that are spaced too far apart. We'll end up with the problem that I just described. And so my advice is to plan for about 1 plant per square foot. And when I say that, I'm referring specifically to our perennials, right? So our herbaceous species, we can crowd those together. Of course, for our woody plants, for our shrubs and our trees, we want to plan for the full size for them to grow. So I am about to plant a low growing Eastern red cedar. They get 4 to 6 feet wide. I'm not going to plant them closer than 6 feet from each other. Okay. But I can, if I, am strategic about it, I can fill in between them with some of the herbaceous species. I put some prices on here. If you are advanced gardeners, I'm sure you know, A, how much plants cost, and B, where to get them for cheaper and for free. I am a huge proponent of the shared economy, plant swaps, seed swaps, all of that. And so don't pay any more for a plant than you have to. But at the same time, of course, we want to make sure that we have healthy plants and we're not spreading things that are overly aggressive. So just some things to keep in mind. So once we have our budget, then we're going to decide on the size and location of the garden that we can actually install. And of course, the location of that garden in your landscape is going to help determine its function, whether it can be more kind of for show or whether it can be more kind of ecologically productive. So what's the focus? These two images are actually taken from the same property, but you can tell the image on the left is a more highly visible space right next to the sidewalk. And so she, chose to favor more structure in, more homogeny in the structure, the different sizes and shapes of the plants, more complementary colors, things like that. There's a lot more, time and energy you can see dedicated in this space to carefully carefully designated edges and mulch and things like that. Where the space on the right, it's like back in the back corner, nobody can see it. And so here is when you can allow for more unrefined plants, maybe more ecologically productive plants that aren't like the prettiest. A great example here is a species like Joe Pyeweed. I mean, I think it's pretty, but it's like 6 feet tall and it kind of flops over if it rains. It's not great for right next to the sidewalk, the first thing next to your front door, but it's great for the middle of a meadow. Okay, so we have our budget, we have our location. One thing that I'll mention here before we get to our next step is a thing called cues to care. So this also has to do with, how to make your messy ecosystem of a garden a little more palatable to your neighbors. I've already mentioned that this is maybe not the traditional aesthetic. Depending where you live, there may even be rules and regulations about the kinds of things that you can plant. And so of course that I hope that you are advocating among your HOAs and et cetera for native plants and all the benefits that come with choosing native plants and this more naturalized landscaping. But with these messy ecosystems, we need orderly frames. This actually comes from a paper written in the 90s where the phrase cues to care was coined. We want to frame our messy ecosystems so that, you know, our neighbors can sort of tolerate it and know that we're not a crazy cuckoo. And so some cues to care include things like mowed and mulched edges, things like pruning your trees and shrubs to have a line of sight to your windows and doors. Here's a major one, having an overlapping sequence of visual interests. So spring bloomers followed by summer bloomers, followed by fall bloomers, and some kind of winter visual interest. Having something blooming, something beautiful at all times of year is a great cue to care. It makes it look like it's purposeful. And then, of course, any kind of structure like raised beds or fences. These are important things to, you know, incorporate into our gardens to help make them look beautiful. Okay, so we're keeping all those things in mind, and now we have to think about timing, right? Which I realize is like the last thing that you want to hear. It's May 13th. If you haven't already planted things this spring, you are like raring to go. But there's some planning ahead and some preparing and perhaps some waiting until a better time, depending on where and what you're planting. So timing is really critical because ideally we want to plant things when that plant can put the most energy possible into establishing its roots and not into flowering, for example. So a great example is to think of our shade-loving plants. Most shade-loving plants bloom in cool soil temperatures, so either in the spring or in the fall. And that is because that's when those shade-loving species are getting the most amount of sunlight. So in the spring, before the canopy leaves out, or in the fall, after the leaves have fallen down, most shade-loving plants will bloom during those times because they can get the most energy from the sun and put it into the production of flowers. And so by, you know, planting something like a phlox, which blooms in the spring at the time when it's blooming, is asking a lot of that plant. It's trying to put its energy into flowers, and we're asking it to also put energy into making, establishing its roots. I realize that this is not always practical or an option. The only time I seem to be able to buy phloxes is in the spring when they're blooming. And it's like horticulturists and plant retailers have figured out that people like buying things when they look really pretty when they're blooming. And so these are kind of like our goals and our ideal situation, but I realize that you may not be able to plant phloxes in the fall because they're just not available. But it's important to think about those things. Fall is a great time also to plant things like shrubs and trees when the ground is nice and warm and it can put its energy into producing and establishing roots over the winter, and it's like it has a head start the next spring. So seasonality, definitely something to think about. And then, you know, after we've kind of planned and we know when we're going to plant things, we kind of have to pause to make sure that what was once there is in fact gone. So i.e. invasive species, turf grass, whatever it is that you are trying to replace. We need to remove what's there thoroughly before we can hope to establish something new. And so there are 3 ways to do this. There are cons to each of them. Option number 1, some kind of chemicals, obviously not ideal. Option number 2, physically manually removing what is there. So you're either, you know, pulling out invasive species or you are removing turf grass. Also not ideal because this disrupts the soil structure and potentially brings dormant weed seeds to the surface. You should never, ever, ever rototill an area that you're going to plant. You're disrupting the soil structure and bringing dormant weed seeds to the surface where they can germinate. So option number 3 is actually the best one, but something that you're not going to want to hear because it's May and you should have done this in November. And that is to try to cover and suffocate what was there for several months in order to kill it. So back in the fall, that is when I'm planning, my new beds for the next year. I kind of map it out, and then I put down 4 to 6 inches of wood mulch to suffocate the turf grass or whatever is there. It works on that all winter long. And then in the spring, I can plant something there. It's not something that's easy to do at this time of year because plants are, our turf grasses in particular are, thriving once the ground warms up, and it doesn't really matter how many inches of mulch you put down, they're going to come up. But you can try. I actually had to do it because I could not find enough mulch in the fall. This is what I mean. Like when we actually need to and should be doing things is not when nurseries and nature centers have the materials for us to do it. Now you can find parking lots full of mulch, but these are our goals. And then, step 3, plant more plants, always, just forever. So we're trying to fill all of those niches. We're using plants as green mulch. Okay. I actually only mulch one time, and that is to try to remove the turf grass or whatever is growing there. That's the only time I will actually mulch. And then I plant things really densely, plant more plants to use as green mulch. They'll fill themselves in over the years, and I'll never have to mulch that spot again. Ta-da! I feel like I should stop for questions here. We have our budget, we have our location, we've removed what's there. We're ready to dive into the layers, but let me pause and see from Susie if you have, I see a lot of blinking questions in the chat.
Yeah, I've got a couple for you, 3 to 4 so far. So feel free to type in a couple more now that we can feed to Erin, or maybe I can answer in the chat. The first one is, someone said she'd heard to cut off the blooms of plants when you plant them. So I guess the phlox you mentioned was in bloom when you purchase it. Is there any reason to do that? I never do or wouldn't want to, but do you have is there any truth to that?
I suppose you could. I don't think it would kill the plant. It's probably not gonna, it depends on the species, but it's probably not going to bloom again that year. There are some species, I will cut back my asters and Joe Pyeweed in order to keep them a little bit shorter and compact. So there are some species that you can do that, kind of pruning back your flowers, and that they'll continue to bloom, but the plants will stay shorter. But I don't know, I have not heard of cutting off all the flowers when you plant them. I mean,
She just followed up, sorry, to say she heard it allows the plant to focus on root growth.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, I understand the concept. I've just never heard that before. I mean, I don't think it would kill the plant, I guess.
Then you'd miss out on the flowers. I guess that's kind of a...
Yeah, then you might not get to see the flowers until the following year.
Okay. Sorry, they're popping up, so I'm going to give you a couple more. One was regarding insect food web type things. So could you comment on lady for eating aphids, and or do birds eat aphids? I'll start with that one.
Yeah, and I suspect that you're asking this because aphids can kind of turn into a nuisance. I get tons of aphids on things like milkweed, a few other species in my garden, but I've honestly never noticed them being so much of a problem that they're killing my plants. And I suspect it's because I have many other nectar producing plants, which lures not just ladybugs, yes, but I also want to draw in my parasitoids, which might be kind of a creepy crawly gross thing to think about, but teeny tiny wasps that will parasitize aphids and the other herbivorous insects that are eating your native plants. So definitely, the more flowering plants you have, the more pollinators, but those pollinators that are eating nectar, they use the herbivorous insects as host plants for their larvae.
There are a couple of questions. I don't know how much you want to get into controlling specific plants, because there are a couple specific plants named here, chameleon and smartweed so far, but others will be named. So I don't know how much you want to get into techniques for each species, or if you want to save that for another forum.
Yeah, I mean, if people have specific advice that you want to put into the chat, feel free. But my advice is usually to look up your local extension service website. Here in Baltimore, we have the University of Maryland Extension, and they actually have an entire page of their website dedicated to different invasive and just weed species. They have them separated by vines versus ground covers and broadleaf plants. And then if you look for the image of your weed, then you can read about the specific tactics or management procedure that you should take with that species, because it does very much depend species by species on when you should try to manage it, and like what method removal or chemical or whatever the case may be. So yeah, it's hard for us to try to, here's the removal method for each invasive weed species that you might come across. It's better to try to look up a resource online or call your extension office.
Thanks. And I see, I want to reiterate what Erin just said in terms of answering each other's questions. So some of you are asking questions and others are answering them. So I want to be mindful to draw your attention back to those and not say them twice. I know some folks just look specifically for an answer from me, but there are other helpful things in here. So there was one follow-up question on a technique in terms of smothering the grass. How about digging it up and flipping it? I don't think you mentioned that one, but I know other folks have tried that. Do you recommend that compared to the mulch and other things you talked about?
I don't. I don't like the removal method in general. I will say I actually did just do it because we're doing sort of a larger community planting in my neighborhood, and we decided that that was the method that we were going to go with. So we actually just kind of like scalped the turf grass off. But no, I imagine if you flipped it, that grass, I mean, tell us in the chat if you have had success with this, but I think the grass would just come back. I think what we did was we kind of like we tried to remove as little soil as possible. We were actually like trying to, knock the soil back onto the ground. And then we mixed in some compost so that I didn't want to put on like a lot of topsoil, but I knew that we were kind of like removing that layer, which is not ideal. And so we put on a little bit of compost and then mulch, and we will see what happens. But imagine if you just flipped it over like that, A, the grass would grow back, and then B, it might be kind of hard to like plant things later. I don't know if that would be my method of choice, but perhaps it has worked for some people.
I will also ask one more question that's kind of a combination of two or two related questions. When you were talking about the Pennsylvania sedge, there are a couple questions that came in after that. Other plants that might serve as a kind of green mulch or other cover crops. I think they mean ground cover in that sense. So if you had a couple other species you might recommend in this moment.
Yeah, we're going to get to that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so some of these are getting specific. I don't know how you want to go since we've got a broader geography tonight, but suggestions for ground cover for shady New England.
Yeah, I'm going to mention some as we go. So we're about to dive into the layers, and I will mention some examples for each one. And then I actually have a few slides that are just kind of lists of species, but you do have to take it with a grain of where do I live in the world and which species are actually native. But I'll try to mention kind of plant groups. But yeah, that is what we are getting to momentarily.
One more question, and that was the cues to care. I apologize that I'm half typing, half listening, but there was number 2 was missed in there. Could you just repeat the 3 cues to care real quick for folks to make sure they captured all 3 there?
There were more than 3. There was mowed or mulched edges. There was an overlapping sequence of visual interest. So having something blooming in the spring and somewhere in fall, and something interesting also to look at in the winter, something that says like, this was planted on purpose. Pruning your shrubs and your trees to have a line of sight to your windows and doors. And then any kind of structure. So any kind of raised beds or fencing, something that kind of designates like, this is on purpose.
Thank you for repeating those. I
Yeah.
think that's all for now. We'll pause and continue discussion in chat and keep going. Thank
Okay. All right. So let's dive into the layers. So we are going to plan our gardens from the top down, which hopefully makes sense because as you get closer to the ground, those plants are going to be impacted by the plants that are taller than them. They're going to get shaded by them. So we're going to start with the very tippy top layer, which is the canopy. And this is not to say that canopy trees aren't beautiful and can't totally be part of your landscape design, but they're so high up, you're not really choosing your canopy trees for like their leaf shape. Or color or things like that. So the canopy layer has a mostly ecological function. And that is why I will recommend trying to focus on the most productive species, right? You're probably not choosing for design type reasons. You're probably not trying to choose your species, your canopy trees for design type reasons. And so you can choose them based on the ecological reasons. So most productive tree species or tree genera are 1, oaks, so Quercus genus, 2, willows, Salix genus, 3, cherries, that's Prunus, 4, hickories, Carya. Those are the most ecologically productive trees that you can plant. So when you're thinking about that canopy layer, trying to focus on those species that are going to have the most complex food webs associated with them. So coming down from the canopy layer, then we get to our understory and our shrubs. And I preface this idea in the introductory workshop that when we're designing our landscapes, we should think about our gardens as outdoor rooms. So we're going to identify these different activity areas, these different rooms in our outdoor spaces, and then connect those outdoor rooms, those activity areas by pathways and fill in the rest with plants. So our understory and shrub layer are what is forming the walls of those outdoor rooms, okay? That's why they're called structural, okay? So we're kind of starting here when it comes to designing. You can think of this layer as kind of the studs of your walls of your outdoor rooms, okay? So these are plants that are gonna provide that structure. And then, you know, you'll see how the rest of the layers sort of allow you to kind of come down to the ground. So examples of plants in the structural layer are any of your small flowering shrubs and trees, but also taller perennials. There's my favorite Joe Pye again, or things like switchgrasses are taller ornamental grasses. Okay, so we're gonna think of these as like the studs of the walls of our outdoor rooms. As we come down closer to the ground, we get to this seasonal theme layer. And these species are probably mostly what you think about when you think about native plants. So you think about your coneflowers and your blazing star are what is pictured here. This is the layer where most of your design is going to happen, where you are going to get to take most of your kind of aesthetic and creative liberties. And that is because this this layer is much more diverse than the other layers. There are just more species of herbaceous plants than there are of woody plants. So you have lots and lots of choices in terms of color and texture and fragrance and the different form that plants take. I mentioned for cues to care, but also for ecological reasons, you want to have that overlapping sequence of bloom so that you are providing a continual source of nectar and seeds If you only have space to plant 3 plants, or you only have a budget to plant 3 plants, choose one that blooms in the spring, one that blooms in the summer, and one that blooms in the fall. Okay, try to get as much of an overlap between your bloom times as you can. So some other examples here, I'm going to give you a whole list later, but I'm sure you can think of these. This is like our bee balms and our goldenrods, all of those things that bloom seasonally. And then the oft forgotten but so important ground cover layer. This is our functional layer. So this is the layer that's responsible for stormwater management and erosion control and weed control. I mentioned this is our green mulch. By planting plants in the ground cover layer, you will never have to use mulch after your plants are established. These species are often shade tolerant. It doesn't mean that you can't plant them in a sunny spot, because these species will emerge early in the spring when the soil is still cool and the days are shorter. There's plenty of sun coming in from the canopy, but it's not the harsh kind of sun that is going to kill these species, because the soil is still cool. Then as the soil temperatures warm up, the other taller species around them, the seasonal theme layer species, are going to grow taller and kind of shade them out. So don't be afraid of planting ground cover species that say that they are shade tolerant in a sunny spot. They will get shaded by the things that are growing around them. So these are things like the sedges that I mentioned, ferns, sedums. These are things that kind of creep and grow between other things. If you are looking in like a book of plants or a catalog, you're looking for plant heights that are like less than a foot. And that's important because, the height of the plant is directly related to the depth of the roots, and you want things that have shallow roots that can fit in between those taller species.
Hey, Erin.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt so rudely, but since I am unable to take notes as I field questions and everything else, I just wanted to get clarity. Someone asked you to repeat the 4 canopy layers: oak, willow, cherry.
Oh, the 4 canopy like genuses. Yeah, so oaks are number 1, followed by willows, followed by prunus, that's your cherries, followed by hickories. But there's like a top 10 list. This is a direct result of the Doug Tallamy research that led to his writing of Bringing Nature Home. So he had a publication that was a kind of a collection of research from all other different publications that ranked and listed different plant genera by how many moth and butterfly species use them as a host plant. And so oaks were like 550 different species use oaks as their host plant. Caterpillar species use oaks as their host plant. And then all the way down to herbaceous species. Goldenrod is actually the most ecologically productive herbaceous species. It hosts 125 different moth and butterfly species. So you can find that list somewhere.
Share the list. Yeah.
On the interwebs.
Our lists anyway, but thank you.
Yes, and that is also, yes, that's also how I created the top 10s, which I will mention later. Okay, so we have our structural layer, our seasonal theme layer, and our ground cover layer. And then because nature refuses to be categorized, of course, we have exceptions. We have these plants called fillers. They don't want to fit into any of these layers. These are species that are just opportunistic growers. They are actually a really great and strategic thing to have in your garden because they will fill in when other species have failed, or maybe where you've disturbed an area by weeding. These are species that are not competitive or persistent. They will get crowded out by other more aggressive species, but then they'll just like pop up somewhere else. So examples of filler species are things like cardinal flower and columbine and blue mist flower. Again, good species to have around, but don't rely on them to grow in the same spot where you planted them. I really like this diagram, again, from Thomas Rayner, because it illustrates how planting in large clumps is so much better for the plant community than these kind of isolated specimens. So on the left, we have the traditional planting with just these large swaths of the same species all planted next to each other. They have to use mulch as filler. There's lots and lots of room for weeds. And as soon as a big storm comes, it's going to wash this all out. On the right, with the multi-layer structure, hopefully you can see these large circles and kind of Mickey Mouse shaped blobs are the structural plants. So they're kind of like randomly about in this planting. The seasonal theme plants are the X's and the triangles, but see how they're planted in clumps? So species triangle is planted in a clump here, species X is planted in a clump here. And then the ground cover is kind of planted intermingledly. I may have just invented that word. You know, planting in clumps creates these masses like, you know, 3 feet plus in diameter. It makes foraging a lot more efficient for our pollinators and our seed foragers, and just aesthetically looks more pleasing to have kind of masses and drifts of the same species that are all together, but then of course, you know, intermingled with the ground cover layer below them. A lot more resistant to being washed out, no room for weeds. That's what we're going for. So on a large scale, we get, you know, a setting like this, basically a meadow where there's no room for weeds. All the plants are very close to each other. We don't, of course, have room necessarily, all of us, to have a space like this. And so on a smaller scale, this is actually the backyard of a row house in Baltimore City, but we can still see the elements of the layers here with, you know, an understory tree and some shrubs, some taller seasonal theme plants, and then filled in with ground covers. On an even smaller scale, this is how these layers look in a space that actually has no land, no ground at all. Every plant in this garden is in either a raised bed or a container, but even in one container, you can have a shrub surrounded by flowering plants and then filled in with ground covers. Sorry, each time I use that laser pointer, I have to turn it off and on, so it makes me have to pause for a second. So I think it's really easy to see the outdoor rooms here in Terry's backyard. So she has her dining area right here behind the house. There's a bird feeder station here. And then there's paths connecting these outdoor activity areas. So there's a path going around the side of the house. This path coming towards us is actually going back to a shed. And then the arching branches form the ceilings of her outdoor rooms. The shrubs form the walls of her outdoor rooms. And then they blend gracefully with the turf grass with the shorter ground covers. No need here for a heavy brown line of mulch, which is really hard and expensive to maintain over time. This is a very easily maintained design, and it doesn't all have to sprout up all at once. You know, she may have planted one shrub at a time and then slowly like moved out into the yard from the edges with the ground cover and the seasonally blooming species. So when it comes time to actually choose the species, you might be disappointed that we're not going to really get to that tonight. There are just so many of us from so many different parts of the world that it would be kind of impossible to do so. But, you know, obviously first you need to know things like what site conditions are present, how much sunlight, how much water is a species going to get, and then have an idea about the room that you would like to create. It can be overwhelming to choose species, just knowing all of those things. But there are a lot of factors that you can use to help narrow down your choices. And so just go one layer at a time, starting at the top. I mentioned that I have some slides with list of species examples. But again, I realize that we are here from all over the world. And so you really need to be able to look up the species that are native and local to you. Local ecotypes is always best. And so I am going to give you some resources where you can look up native plants for your area. But just to get an idea, these are some examples of ground cover species. So there are things here like sedges and wild ginger. Stonecrop is a native sedum, but there are also some blooming things. So golden groundsel pachyra is one of our favorite ground covers because it just kind of like spreads out on the ground. Heath aster, I love. I just planted it for the first time last year, and it's already kind of like filling in all the spaces. And then looks like I have a cultivar called Snow Flurries. It just kind of looks like snow in the fall. Creeping phlox, of course, all of these really low growing things. These are ground cover species to avoid. There is a reason that they are so good at establishing and spreading. So thank you, no thank you to the vinca, to the pachysandra, although there is a native species of pachysandra, to the English ivy, to the creeping jenny. Just say no. Friends don't let friends plant English ivy. I can send these if you are frantically scribbling. I'm so sorry, I should have mentioned. I can send these to all of you as a PDF when I send you your follow-up email with the recording tomorrow. So don't feel like you have to be frantically scribbling. So some ideas for seasonal theme species, of course, the things that you would think of, your bee balms and your milkweed and your black-eyed Susans, which I believe are actually native to most of the United States, but they are Maryland state flowers, so we love them here. Geranium is a good shade-loving bloomer, of course, your goldenrods and your sunflowers and your asters. But also don't forget about, some of your grasses. Things like little bluestem has such beautiful fall color, and the seeds can be so beautiful. So don't sleep on your grasses and rushes and sedges. Sorry, I hope you can't hear the ice cream truck is coming by outside. It's about that time, I guess. And then our structural species. Sorry, I should have ordered these in the opposite direction because I said that we should start at the top and work our way down. So, some taller things here like your shrubs, your hollies. Vaccinium is your blueberries and cranberries. Viburnums. Hemamelis is witch hazel. Rhododendrons. Lindera is your spice bush. A little taller than that, serviceberries. Dogwoods, small cherry trees, and then your really tall perennial plants. So your blazing stars and goldenrods and ironweed gets like 7 feet tall. So some resources where you can look up some species that are native to you that I would recommend. Of course, Audubon's own native plant database. I have actually put one of these search bars on our website. So you can go to audubon.org, which is National Audubon/native plants, put in your zip code, and you can actually filter by what types of birds you would like to attract. If you want to invite hummingbirds or orioles, you can filter by that. Another great thing about this website is that you will also get a tab at the top that says local resources. So that is where you can find, if you are not here in Baltimore, that's where you can find other, Audubon centers or chapters that have habitat recognition programs or other workshops, and also native plant nurseries that are close to you. So make sure you check out that local resources tab. Another website that I love and I use constantly is the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center's website, which has a native plants advanced search feature. So you put in your state. It doesn't get any more specific than that, unfortunately, but you put in your state and then you can put in which layer you're looking for. So, shrub layer, tree layer, herbaceous layer, vines. And then, so I'm just checking my time real quick. And then bloom time and soil moisture and sunny versus shady, deer resistant, if that's a thing. I don't think that it actually is, but you can search by all of those things. It's a really great resource. Once you have that list of what can actually survive in your area, I hope that you will use the top 10 list that we have developed, and we have them available to download on our website. I'm sure Susie is putting them in the chat for you right now. So this is where you can find that list that I started to mention earlier, excuse me, where we are ranking plant genera. So these are groups of plants, not species, groups of plants by how ecologically productive they are. So on our list of trees is where you'll see the oaks and the cherries, and then within those genera, you'll be looking for species that are native to your area. The shrubs list are, of course, smaller, and I sneaked a vine on there. And then your herbaceous plants. I try to choose groups of plants that are actually available in production. So there are like native species of violets and native species of clover that are actually really amazing for wildlife, but not so easy to find in production. So I tried to stick to ones that you will hopefully be able to find. And then in our last 10 minutes or so, I wanted to mention some different tips for bird-friendly garden maintenance. So, you have your garden, what are the things that you should be focusing on each season to be taking care of it in a way that the bugs and the birds will love you for? So in the fall, we are mostly thinking about leaving the leaves. I don't know who came up with the phrase leaf litter for the leaves that fall on the ground, because they are so important to our ground foraging birds and for our overwintering insects. That is where your Luna moths, their pupa are going to be under the leaves. And so please don't remove them. You can certainly rake them into your flower beds. It's essentially nature's mulch. This is how, forests mulch themselves, is losing all of those leaves in the fall. So definitely leave the leaves as much as you can. In the winter, we are leaving those dead and dried flower heads and herbaceous stems. If you have a container garden, we are clustering those containers together, insulating them with things like leaves and snow or blankets. These are native plants. Even if you have them in pots, you don't need to bring them inside. But you just want to kind of insulate them because they are getting that cold and wind from all directions, as opposed to plants that are in the ground. Also want to protect your pots so that they don't break. In the spring, once it's, consistently about 50, 60 degrees, that's when you can cut back and use those dried twigs that you're cutting back, those dried stems, to actually mulch into your beds. This is basically garden maintenance according to Mother Nature. When does Mother Nature mulch? In the fall, when all the leaves drop. When does Mother Nature compost? When all of those leaves are decomposing and all of those nutrients are going into the ground. So in the spring is when we're applying compost, just like nature does. And then in the summer, we are watching out for weeds and trying to be conservative with our water use. This could be a great time to install a rain barrel. Not so great to use water from a rain barrel on your edible plants. Just think about, the water's running off of the roof and what else it's picking up on the way. You probably don't want to spray that on the plants that you're eating, but on your habitat garden, it's perfect. So a great way to conserve water in the summer. Lots of other tips on these handouts, which are also available to be downloaded from our website. So finally, I hope that many of you will take what you've learned here tonight and our online resources and create bird-friendly spaces in wherever it is that you live, work, and play. So at your homes, at your businesses, your schools, your kids, your grandkids' schools, in your community. And if your garden is in Maryland or DC, you can apply for recognition and get this beautiful Baltimore Oriole adorned sign for your garden. It's catching on. We have over 250 approved gardens in the state of Maryland. And there are many other sign programs like this throughout the country. So just remember to look at that local resources tab. I mentioned that you can find some materials to download on our website, and that is where you can find them. So patterson.audubon.org, under the conservation tab, there is a link to bird-friendly communities. And if you think your garden is ready and you want to apply for your sign right now, you can click here for bird-friendly habitat sign. Also in the top corner will take you to the same place where you can actually, you can download a copy of the application. It's kind of nice to have it as a guide, or you can, hopefully it actually saves us a step if you fill out the application online. And then you'll have your little bird icon appear on our map. So we would appreciate it if you did that. Susie, I am realizing that I forgot to do our poll, which I usually do at the very beginning. And so I might just throw a couple questions out there since we have a little bit of time before taking our Q&A. Thanks for bearing with us, folks. We just kind of like to have this data as well. So now's the time, if you have questions for the Q&A, to put them into the chat. But in the meantime, I would love your answers to a couple of questions just to kind of track where folks are, both geographically and in your gardening. So first poll is launched. We would love to know where you're from. Baltimore, or maybe you're in Maryland outside of Baltimore, or maybe you're in the mid-Atlantic but outside of Maryland. We definitely heard from several folks who are in the US but outside of the mid-Atlantic, and then even a few who are outside the US. So we would love to hear that. It looks like 80% of you have put in your answer. Really appreciate it. I'm gonna close this in 5 seconds. Get your choice in. 3, 2, 1. Okay. Lots of awesome representation from the mid-Atlantic, but also some other places. So thank you for joining us. I have a second question. We are wondering what kind of garden space you have, and this is a check all that apply. So if you have a container garden, that's great. I learned recently that the average American yard is a 1/4 acre, which I found to be huge because that's way bigger than my property. But so a 1/4 acre is average, but here I'm showing it as if it's like the smallest. But we want to hear if you have a larger yard, and then also think about all the other places where you can garden. A school garden, so great for outdoor and hands-on learning. Don't forget about business gardens, community gardens. We have recognized several in the state of Maryland. And then of course you are very welcome here if you do not have a garden yet, but you are aspirational. So I'm going to close this poll in 5 seconds. I have such a great, there's such a great variety of representation here. So that is awesome. And then I think I have 2 more, but one is just a yes, no. So have you already attended our introductory gardening workshop? Yes or no? Oh, this is so exciting. Sorry, I realize that you can't see the votes coming in, but it's exciting for me. Okay, we always see a huge flux of registration for this workshop immediately after the introductory workshops. And we actually only did 2 of these advanced workshops this spring, and they both filled. And filled is 450 registrants, by the way. Okay, so 3/4 of you took the introductory workshop and 1/4 of you did not. Thanks. Okay, last question. Sorry, I usually do these at the beginning, but I was just so excited to get started, I guess. Now, I mean, you should have all of the information that you need to answer this question at this point. Do you think your garden is bird friendly? This is amazing. Yes, no, or you're still not sure. All right, looks like most people have voted, so I'm going to close the poll in 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. This is amazing and actually pretty consistent. Most of the time during these workshops that we answer this question, we get about 70% of people who think, yeah, my garden is bird friendly, which means it's time to get your sign, people. All right, that's it. Thank you so much for bearing with me. I am ready to take your questions if you have any.
If you're ready, I'll say my quick piece and then feed you those questions that are still coming in via the chat. Is that okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, just a quick friendly reminder about a couple things. For those who missed it at the beginning, Erin will send a very helpful email tomorrow with a few important links. One of them is please take the brief survey. That is helpful input and feedback for us. There will be a link to this recording. She also mentioned she would send a PDF of some of those core slides with some plant lists and combinations and things. You will also get several of the links that I've posted more than once in the chat as they've come up more than once. Those are the top 10 lists and our website with the other resources such as the seasonal maintenance recommendations and those things. Remember to apply for your Audubon sign if you are in a place that has one. I did post in the chat the National Audubon sign is one you can do if you don't have a local Audubon signage program like we do in Maryland and DC. I also ask that if you have found tonight to be beneficial and valuable, then please do make a donation to Patterson Park Audubon Center. I will put that link in the chat again shortly. We do appreciate you. We like to keep our commitment to these free programs open to everyone with an internet connection, right? But if you're able, we would appreciate your support. We do have to raise all of our funds locally for these programs that we do for the community. So I'll make that available momentarily. And keep an eye out for upcoming events. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. Do like and share what's coming out now. We are celebrating the Baltimore Mayor's proclamation for Plants for Birds, which is a huge and exciting step toward getting support for more of this happening in more places and restoring those ecosystems in our city. And also National Audubon has lots of information if you're interested in doing the same in your municipality. Good stuff. So with that, let me start you off with a question about cultivars. It's going to be two-part because there have been multiple cultivar questions, but one is about tips on identifying to know a cultivar versus a straight species. Perhaps you should define cultivar before you answer anything. Make sure everyone knows, but also how to ID, any tips you have, and then also just the ecological benefits question about, do they serve birds in the same way?
Okay, so a cultivar is a plant that is genetically bred for a specific quality. So lots of times plants are bred to have longer bloom times or particular colored flowers. Think of roses. There's like a million different cultivars for different shapes and flowers. And if you've ever seen a wild rose, how different it looks from the roses that you buy, from a florist. So cultivars just mean that we are selecting for a particular quality and, breeding plants for that quality. It's a really interesting question about whether cultivars are as ecologically beneficial as the straight species. And there's a pretty limited amount of research on that. When I was in graduate school, actually, one of my lab mates was studying that specifically. And so it's kind of an area where, we're still getting information. The kind of, I would say, guidelines for that is that if it's a cultivar that selects for something like a longer bloom time or something to do with the flowers, but not necessarily the leaf chemistry, then I see less reason to be concerned. I mean, the main reason for choosing native plants is that we want our local insects to be able to actually eat the leaves. That's what's going to, allow that energy to pass to the next levels of the food web. And so as long as we're not altering the leaf chemistry, insects should still be able to digest and eat the leaves of those plants. If there's a cultivar that changes the leaf chemistry, either for like fall color is a popular one, then that's a little bit, more questionable about whether that might impact the species, the insects that use that species as a host plant. So I would maybe tend to avoid cultivars like that. But a lot of times planting in small spaces like we do here in the city, we are choosing cultivars that have like a more compact habit, or, our dwarf, smaller, shorter species. And so that's something that you might choose like from a landscape design perspective. How to identify a cultivar versus not. Like when you're actually looking at the plant, I'm not sure how you would do that unless you know what the straight species looks like and the thing that you're looking at looks different. But at a nursery, you always know that it's a cultivar because it has the name of the species, genus, species, and then something in like quotations. So I'm thinking specifically of this aster that we love to use, the aromatic aster. The cultivar is called Radon's Favorite. And now, of course, I'm going to blank on the genus and species. Susie, help me.
Boy.
Never mind. Why did I choose that one?
Oblongifolius. Oh gosh. Not sure.
Aster never mind, guys. Maybe you know it, but it has Radon's Favorite is like in quotations after the genus and species. That's how you know that it's a cultivar. Fireworks is a favorite goldenrod cultivar. It says fireworks at the end. Maybe somebody in the chat knows it.
I was trying to pull
Aster oblongifolius. Is that it?
That's the one I was guessing.
I got it.
Is that it?
Yeah, oblongifolius. Linda typed it in right after I said it. I promise it was said it.
Not that it matters. A minute ago. Yeah, but here it is. I just checked it on our spreadsheet for the planting we have coming up. Okay, let me ask you a question about protecting. There's a question about a small public plot that it has been planted for butterflies but keeps getting mowed, and they've given instructions and it keeps getting mowed. So I guess it's sort of a diplomacy question. And many of us deal with this in various ways in terms of homeowners associations and other kinds of things where there's not a common understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Says, any suggestions as to how to get a small public parcel of land designated as a protected monarch space? There's an empty corner that has the best milkweed in my town and it constantly gets mowed. The folks who tend to the land have instructions, but maybe some sort of status, I guess, perhaps as a monarch way station, maybe. What would be your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that as an organization we deal with all the time, because either in a public space like in Patterson Park or at a school, unless the relationships are built and the communication is really well established between, the people who want this garden and the people whose job it is to maintain the landscaping, then you do, of course, have like really unfortunate incidents like that. And we've all, we've experienced it as well. So I don't know if I have any more advice than the obvious, which is just to like really make sure that you are taking the time to build these relationships and make sure all the stakeholders are at the table before deciding, this is the best thing for this spot. And then, of course, some kind of signage is always really helpful. So if you can get a space designated as a monarch way station, that's a sign that is specific for monarch butterflies and milkweed, or as a bird-friendly habitat, or various other kind of like wildlife garden certifications. Or just, some kind of interpretive signage that maybe you design. I know that there's a lot of success with signs that are designed or drawn by kids. If you can get, if this is at a school, or if you can get kids from the local community involved in, drawing signs, they can be really persuasive. So that's the only advice I have. I feel like that's pretty obvious. If anybody has any other more specific information, you can put it into the chat, but
That's a good point about the kids. There has been research that shows that adults respond better to making smart choices about behaviors when the sign has been illustrated by kids or the message comes from kids. Next question regarding climate change. Should we be considering native species to regions? Well, I guess all of us tonight are in the northern hemisphere, so more southerly species that might be ready for the warming climate that's coming that is on its way and already here. Thoughts on that? Natives.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I almost think more of like weather patterns than, so like, does a particular space get more water? Does water tend to sit in the soil for longer? Or does it undergo longer periods of drought where the soil is drying out for longer? And so I don't, maybe these are the same thing. Maybe choosing more southerly species is the same as also choosing species that are more adaptable or willing to withstand periods of drought or periods of wetness. It's definitely something to think about, but I think it just means being really in tune with your space and checking for things like soil moisture and yeah, I mean, mostly it's soil moisture. Is there long periods of drought or long periods of wetness?
Thank you. There was a question, this might be a first. Is it possible to create a snag from a large branch about 8 feet long that has fallen from a tree? Could you, I guess the question is, turn it 90 degrees, invert it, and create a snag?
So I have actually seen in people's yards where I don't know if I've seen like a fallen limb. Maybe I have, but I've definitely seen like a stump that they have like turned into a bird feeder or turned into a snag. I don't know how it would work as a snag, but it would also be valuable like lying on the ground. I mean, maybe not in the same way like for cavity nesters, but that's an interesting project. I'm not sure how you would actually do that. Like
safely, right?
I do say when I'm visiting, when you submit your habitat application, if you're, within Baltimore or a certain radius, I like to visit people's gardens, and having snags is like an automatic gold star on your bird-friendly habitat application because I think that they get a lot of, there's a lot of worry about them falling on, houses or cars or people. And so if that's not a concern, they are just so, so valuable to cavity nesters and insect eaters, woodpeckers, everything. So if you have the opportunity to keep a snag, please do it. You will get a gold star on your habitat sign.
All right, as far as I know, I've got one more question. Last call for questions. There was a question about Callery pears and removing them and replacing with oaks. But I think the question is, I'm trying to scroll back and find it. I think it was about tips for removing the pear. I'll let you know if I find the specifics, but I have a feeling you have comments already on that.
Yeah, Callery pear, same as Bradford pear. I hope I'm not wrong about that, but I think of them as being the same thing. So very popular.
Bradford's a kind of Callery pear, as I understand it. But
okay, so very popular street tree species. I don't know why, because they're actually terrible street trees. All of the branches come out of one spot and it makes the trunk super weak, and they eventually, branches fall onto your car. And then of course they became highly invasive, but this is just, another example of an invasive plant that came from the ornamental industry. Most of them do. In terms of removing them, the same as you would have to grind this. I mean, it's a tree, so the same as you would remove any kind of tree, you'd have to grind the stump and I would not rely on just kind of cutting it. I think that it would just sucker and do what it does. I don't
Thank
know
you.
if I have any more specific advice than that.
Thank you. I didn't find the rest of the question, but I think that was it. There was.
But if you have the opportunity to replace a Bradford pear with an oak tree, please do. That's the advice. Everybody should do that.
I think that's all. Our last discussion, just for you to know, so we had a little back and forth about a snag, defining a snag. So we've done that, and a couple of folks helped out with that. So I'm glad we talked about what is a snag and why it's so important. So
yes.
I think we are finished for the evening. So please wrap us up. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for all of your questions. And, you know, we love learning from you, and I hope that you enjoyed learning from each other as much as from me. So I know that this can be a really challenging proposition for us to transform all of our spaces into something that's more beneficial for other species. But this is, you know, finally within our power, as Doug Tallamy is saying here, to make a difference. And so that challenge is kind of the delight of gardening after all. So thank you all so much for being here. I hope everybody is staying safe and taking care, and hopefully we will get to see each other again really soon. Thanks. Have a good night.